You're on the news track. The war of words between the United States and China is peaking, with the US being one of the worst hit countries. The Trump administration is pointing fingers at Beijing. Senior members of the US government have come out to say that they have concrete evidence of China's role in concealing crucial information about the outbreak, and also of the fact that the virus, they believe, came out of a Chinese laboratory. Take a look at this report.
Two global powers at loggerheads in the aftermath of the pandemic. With Donald Trump alleging that the coronavirus originated in a lab in China, America is mincing no words in pinning the blame for the contagion on Beijing. The latest to add to the China lab theory is US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
Remember, China has a history of infecting the world, and they have a history of running substandard laboratories. These are not the first times that we've had a world exposed to viruses as a result of failures in a Chinese lab. I can tell you that there is a significant amount of evidence that this came from that laboratory in Wuhan.
While Beijing has repeatedly denied that it covered up the extent or severity of the virus outbreak, United States has been relentless in its attack. Now it's demanding details about patient zero from China.
Details of where patient zero, where this began, are things that are knowledge that's in the possession of only the Chinese Communist Party. They're the ones that can help unlock that. If they need technical assistance, we're happy to provide.
With the United States under President Donald Trump no longer interested in wanting to play the role of the leader of the free world, China was hoping to step in and fill that void. But the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath have administered a massive reputational loss for the world's second biggest economy. To help us read the tea leaves in Beijing, I'm joined on the news track by the world's leading authority on China outside mainland China, Dr. Michael Pillsbury. Michael Pillsbury is the director of the Chinese strategy at Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Pillsbury is the author of 3 best-selling books on China. He wrote The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. Way back in 1975, when he was at the Rand Corporation, Dr. Pillsbury wrote defining articles which became the basis of President Reagan's historic rapprochement with China. So for 45 years, our guest today has worked closely with multiple administrations in the US in crafting the China policy, and there are very few who understand what's going on in the mind of the dragon in the way that he does. At present, he's a consultant in the Department of Defense, and President Trump takes his advice very seriously, and he said so in public many times over. Dr. Pillsbury, welcome to India Today.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction.
Dr. Pillsbury, we just heard from Mike Pompeo say that there is concrete evidence to suggest that the Wuhan virus, the coronavirus, came out of a virological laboratory in Wuhan. Is that your understanding as well? If there is such evidence, what kind of evidence does the United States have? Or is this just down to election time politics in the US?
I think the evidence is something that the American President and Secretary of State do not want to make public at this time. The main approach that is being taken is to ask China for cooperation. China knows a lot. They published a lot of studies about the nature of the virus, who gets it. For example, do young people under the age of 10, do they get it with equal intensity and frequency as older people? China's done a number of studies about the virus. So cooperation with them to find ways to beat the virus, that's the first priority. The problem is, to some degree, it's quite important for outsiders, including for Indian scientists, to know who was patient zero, what is the exact nature of this virus. And some of the evidence about the lab in Wuhan comes from China itself. China has a very famous researcher named Shi Changli. She is quite fondly called the Batwoman by Scientific American, which had an article about her 3 months ago, So she collects bats. She's very courageous. She goes into bats all over China, brings back samples, takes their blood and their urine and feces. So she has a laboratory of just this kind of virus. She says it was brought to her December 30th in Wuhan in her lab, and she tested it and discovered that it's 96% like other viruses she has, but it's not completely the same. So this has caused some of the suspicion to begin. We have asked, and so has the CDC, in which India is a leading member, we've asked for scientists to visit this lab in Wuhan since January 4th. China still refuses. This is adding to the mystery and the concern.
So you understand the dynamics and the tea leaves in China better than anyone else. At this moment, what's your best sense of whether or not the virus came out of a lab in China? Because they haven't allowed for an international probe, so we don't know. All we are hearing is Bat Lady tell us that it's not her creation or that it's a natural virus. She has something which is 96% similar. If you tell me about something which is 96% similar, I as an investigative reporter, I'm immediately very concerned about what about the other 4%, and only when some international credible scientist goes in will I know. China can't be judge and jury at the same time.
Yes, well, that's the problem. It looks like it's a fact that everybody agrees that from the time the first virus case was discovered, which may be as early as November, until the time China informed the world that this was a human-to-human spreading virus with a high lethality death rate, that's about 2 months. So during that 2 months, as the virus spreads and kills people, it's rather obvious what could the world have done, whether India or United States, France, Italy, what could have been done if we'd been told in early December, we've discovered a new virus, it's very dangerous, its so-called transmissibility is very rapid, and it kills people much more than the flu or other viruses like this. That might have made a huge difference. Some estimates are millions of people's lives could have been saved, or they could have not been subjected to the sickness. This seems to be, no one doubts that China did this. The cover-up is undisputed, and one can punish China in many different ways for this. That's part of our debate now here in Washington, D.C., how to hold China accountable and punish them. But the problem is, at this time, we also want what I mentioned, cooperation from China, more knowledge about the virus, and frankly, more studies that they're doing on vaccines. The race to get a vaccine is underway now. China is testing some of our vaccine formulas on Chinese people, but they seem to have far more vaccine experiments going on than we know about. So China holds the key to a vaccine.
Dr. Pillsbury, you're the author of a best-selling book, The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. As a continuum of that book, what does the pandemic do? Does the pandemic and China's response to it and America's lethargy and inward-looking approach take China a step closer to replace America as the global superpower?
Well, a lot of Chinese think that way. They think that the Chinese recovery from the pandemic in China is much more rapid. They released some figures yesterday that 99% of their big companies, their state-owned enterprises, are back at work. We're nowhere near that. In fact, it's not clear that the American economy has even peaked yet in terms of the damage that's been done. So China may come out of this much faster. They already have said that they'll probably have a 3% GDP growth rate this year in 2020, despite the massive losses in the last 3 or 4 months. The American estimates for our growth rate this year are not clear, but it looks like China could move ahead of our economic size. That's been their goal for many, many decades. They feel that they used to have 25% of the world economy for about 1,000 years, and they want to get back to that period. By the way, they rate India, they rate all countries by what they call their comprehensive power, which includes largely economic factors, but also science and technology. They rate India as between number 7 and number 6 in the world. So they see India as rising, but they're still well ahead the size of the Indian economy.
What's your estimate of by when China thinks it will go ahead of the United States and become the world's top superpower, and to what extent does the pandemic accelerate that trend?
Well, we don't know the answer, at least I don't know the answer, to how fast the U.S. economy will recover. In many ways, when I wrote that book, I was talking about China's secret strategy to replace America. It's no longer secret. I think it's widely known around the world now that China's ambition, and they're quite open about it themselves, is to be the number one power. They feel they're more virtuous. They feel that the world order under Chinese leadership will be a lot more fair and just to the developing world. They have unrelenting criticism of America. America has done so many bad things, according to the Chinese. The Americans invade small countries like Iraq, and we don't follow United Nations Security Council rules, and we're unfair to our own people here at home. So the Chinese have had this unrelenting criticism of America as the world leader, and they feel that, humble and modest as they may be, they feel that perhaps their time has come. And frankly, a lot of Americans agree with them. We have a strong sort of left-wing point of view in our country that says we don't want to be the world's leader anymore. China deserves a chance for the next 50 or 100 years or more to be the number one country in the world.
But it's not just on the left. It's Donald Trump on the right who's saying he doesn't want to lead the world. He's leading the march towards America wanting to be inward looking and focusing on just what's happening as opposed to playing the leader of the free world.
No, not exactly. The president's never said, I don't want to be leader of the free world. He does want to be leader of the free world. What he has said is make America first, American interest first. And this obviously upsets many people all over the world. However, most countries' leaders also are for their country first. What President Trump's trying to do is just follow that path. Obviously, he's exposed a lot of assistance, and I discuss this in my book. We've helped China a great deal over the last 30 years. Frankly, this is quite important. We've helped China far more than we ever helped India. Our direct investment in China is one of the secrets of their growth. We invest 20 times more per year in China than in India. In terms of scientific cooperation, we have massive agreements with China for scientific cooperation, very few with India. I did an article one time which I was advised not to publish, just comparing how much we've helped China over the last 30 or 40 years and how compared to India. So I think the president's trying to change that now and have India be a better friend than China. But 40 years of assistance to China in capital and technology, in cooperation in many areas, it's going to be hard to make up the gap, the deficit in terms of our relationship with India. I strongly support a better relationship with India.
Dr. Pillsbury, the last several weeks have seen a massive and growing global backlash against China. We've seen even countries like Australia, which are very close economically to China, hitting back very aggressively. In Europe, there have been complaints about faulty PPE kits, faulty testing kits. In India, there's a growing backlash. In the United States, there's a building backlash. Do you think countries outside the United States would be willing to accept China's leadership because they're economically vulnerable, China wanting to help in Europe, in Asia and in Africa? Will these countries follow America's lead? Will they follow China's lead?
I think they will because of the power of money. China's already about 80% the size of our GDP before we went into the crisis of the virus. Their growth rate has been 3 times as fast as our growth rate just for the last 5 years. Before that, they were sometimes 5 times faster than us year to year. So you can't stop this. This is the Chinese threat to us. They say, look, we're going to have, first of all, we're going to surpass you Americans in a year or two. Then we're going to keep on growing 3 times as fast. So we will be double your economy, double the American economy, and then triple the American economy by 2049. We're going to own all the major companies in the world. Many people used to make fun of China. They had 0 companies on what's called the Fortune 500 list, the biggest companies in the world. China, can you want to guess? China has now surpassed us. They have 130 companies on the list compared to our 110. This is the largest companies in the world are Chinese. The largest banks in the world, the top 4 banks in the world are Chinese. So how is a country going to resist? In Africa or South America, you have examples in South Asia too. How are they going to resist?
But Dr. Pillsbury, the pandemic changes quite a lot, because now there's focus on self-reliance, nationalization, there's focus also on reordering of global supply chains, a lot of manufacturing wanting to move out of China, because in the middle of a crisis, China is proving to be unreliable, which means that China won't have the kind of free run it did for the last 4 decades. Do you think that could slow China's march, or not really?
This is an option under debate here. So far, it's just talk. We would have to have special tax benefits for American companies to come home from China. Same thing with Indian companies in China. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's too late to block China's domination of the world. It would take an enormous effort on the part of many, many countries getting together, condemning Chinese behavior and saying we're going to decouple. What I see so far is a lot of talk, a lot of articles in newspapers, and no action. If that changes, I hope you cover it, because it'll be big news if somebody actually does something in this area.
Now, I want to share with you the assessment of the Indian foreign policy establishment. There was a piece recently by Vijay Gokhale, who used to be our foreign secretary and before that was the ambassador in China, and he's speaking about 2 or 3 things. So I'll build on those. One, his sense is that there is some discontent building within China against President Xi Jinping's leadership, and there have been some articles written by former members of the Communist Party which he cites to say that this is proof that the murmurs against Xi's leadership are growing. Is that your reading of the tea leaves as well, sir?
No, there are such articles. There are a couple that appeared just 2 weeks ago. But to put any weight on them is really wishful thinking. It's often an excuse for doing nothing about China to say any one of these 2 things. Number one, the doves and the reformers are complaining about Xi Jinping, so all we have to do is hope they will somehow change the policy. The other claim, a very common excuse for doing nothing, is to say, the Chinese are going to collapse. They can't maintain this growth rate. That's been a claim for 20 years now in some books called The Coming Collapse of China. During those 20 years, did China collapse? No. It grew by 1,000%. China's economy is 10 times bigger than it was 20 years ago, while we've all been telling ourselves either the reformers are going to take over or the economy is going to collapse. And these are just excuses for doing nothing. We've got to do something, or the inevitable trend is rather obvious.
What is it that you recommend? You're passionately advocating that the world do something. So what do you think the US should do? What should be India's role in that? What should other powers be doing to try and contain China's rise?
Well, there's a long list, but the most important thing is to buy a copy of the 100-Year Marathon. I give the history. I give the history of the last 30 years, why we helped China so much and why we helped India and other friends so little. This is quite a story. I noticed the Audible version you can buy takes 21 hours to listen to the whole book. So I can't summarize everything for you right now, but the first step is recognition of what is China's strategy. Is this just a poor, backward country that's about to fall apart and we should feel sorry for them? Or is this a country that has a strategy, it has a unified leadership, and it has consistency over the decades? This is what I argue in the book, and I do give some steps at the end, 12 steps that should be taken. But it's too much to give them to you now. I don't think you've read my book either.
No, but I look forward to. I've been reading all your articles that you've been posting on the pandemic and everything that's happening right now. So we're following this conversation very, very closely. The other thing that's happened, which is very interesting, sir, is this new article that appeared in a state-run think tank in Beijing, which talks about a huge reputational loss, a Tiananmen-style backlash globally against Beijing. That's got a lot of headlines world over. How seriously would Xi Jinping and the top leadership of the Communist Party be taking that?
Well, this is one of China's most prestigious think tanks. I've been there, 15 times myself. Many Indian scholars have visited. They're affiliated with the Ministry of State Security. So it would be like your RNW had its own think tank and then put out a study. I think Xi Jinping takes this backlash question seriously, but he's handling it very well. The Chinese have a multi-billion-dollar kind of disinformation structure or they put out in tweets on television stations. They buy local TV and radio stations in different countries. They have their counter argument. This is not China's fault. China's sending masks out. China wants to help everybody. And they planted the theory several weeks ago that this is really the Americans. It was an American soldier who came to Wuhan in October in the military contest, and that somehow this American soldier is the source of the virus. Secretary Pompeo attacked that right away, but the damage was done. They're planning the story that if it wasn't the Americans, then it was some other, anonymous bat or civet cat, as they sometimes say, that this is the natural source of the virus. So don't worry about China doing this kind of thing. They're very effective. Their propaganda is probably the best in the world.
There's been a lot said about how China is deflating the numbers of COVID cases, the number of people who've died because of the coronavirus, and that the situation, and especially those who've left China, are elsewhere but belong to mainland China, say they are getting reports from Chinese social media that there's a big mess, that bodies are piling up, the Chinese government is lying, and that the people are getting outraged with this. Is that true? Is that exaggerated? What's your sense?
Well, one way we know this is from Radio Free Asia Mandarin service. We have a congressionally created program that calls in to China, and they called to Wuhan for several weeks, and they asked people what is happening in the crematoria and the graveyards, how many bodies do you see, and the estimate came back about 10 times higher number, about 40,000 dead bodies compared to what China was reporting, only 4,000 dead, just in the Wuhan area. I think India should have this kind of service, a Mandarin broadcast into India, from India into China, to find out what's going on and broadcast it back, because the Chinese people don't have access except for these foreign broadcasts. They don't really know what's going on. So they listen to what I call Radio Free Asia Mandarin service. You can actually call in from China and answer questions and go online. Of course, you have to conceal your identity and maybe throw away your phone. But I hope India will set up this kind of program to broadcast into China what the truth is about what's going on.
So do you think the concealment of numbers will create some kind of a backlash against the communist leadership and the president?
You mean inside China? No, they have a very sophisticated control system. They have no real fears of a revolt or mutiny. They don't have an annual, New Hampshire primary and our style election. They certainly don't have the rough and tumble of your Indian elections, which the whole world watches because there's so much excitement. China doesn't have this. You criticize Xi Jinping, you're dead or you disappear.
Lastly, is Donald Trump coming back in your view in November?
I have no way of knowing. We're all waiting here to find out what Joe Biden's going to say about China. Okay. So far, he's been silent on China. He says he'll keep some of the tariffs, but he has a lot of open room now. He could run against Trump and say Trump is too weak on China, that Joe Biden, will be tougher. That's one option he has. Some of his advisors.
So, most people we invite as guests on China, either hawkish or dovish. You've provided a sense of brutal realism, which is deeply appreciated, and you also speak with so much experience to back every one of your arguments. It's been an absolute delight. Dr. Michael Pillsbury, the world's foremost expert in China, author of many best-selling books on what's going on inside China. Thank you very much, sir. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you did too, and I'd love to have you back on our network in a few weeks.
Buy my book.
I love the American in you, an unabashed shopman, a salesman as well, saying go out and buy a book. Okay, thank you very much. Our viewers have heard that as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Pillsbury.